I thought this cabin was empty, until that brass ring answered something about my family.
She was 25 and homeless. No room, no job, no family willing to take her in. Just a canvas tool roll and $9 she had saved from 3 weeks of skipped suppers. And with those $9, she bought a forgotten banjo maker's cabin outside Barnardsville, Buncombe County, North Carolina, where the lane had vanished from maps in 1987. The north sill had split beneath the floor. Rain entered through 2 valleys in the roof. The county condemned it on October 14th, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. But inside a detached brass resonator ring was a seam-thin chamber, unopened for decades, holding money, silver fittings, and a song that would alter the shape of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sadie Mercer had been fitting broken edges together her whole life without knowing it. She grew up in a rented duplex above a tire shop in Knoxville, where the windows trembled whenever the compressor started below. At 8, she learned to mend chair rungs with glue and cotton string. At 12, she could sharpen a plain iron on the back step while rain ticked against the aluminum awning. Nothing in the house matched, but nearly everything had been repaired. Her mother, Elaine, worked the early shift in a hospital laundry and kept all receipts in a biscuit tin. She measured safety in paid bills, sealed envelopes, and doors that locked. When Sadie brought home a carved scrap of maple, Elaine saw dust on the floor before she saw the clean curve of the wood. The person who did see it was Amos Mercer, Elaine's father, a retired wood-turner with a narrow shop behind his house in Maryville. Every Saturday, Sadie rode 2 buses to him carrying egg sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Amos turned bowls, porch finials, and once each winter, a banjo rim from 3 thin strips of maple steamed, bent, and glued around an iron form. He sang old mountain verses without finishing them. Sadie swept shavings into a peach crate, warmed hide glue in a water bath, and watched him test a rim by tapping it with 1 knuckle. Before supper, he let her make a single careful pass on the lathe. The ritual lasted 9 years. Wood tells the truth after the blade passes, Amos said. He meant that polish could flatter a surface, but a cut revealed grain, strain, and every impatient hand that had touched it. He died during Sadie's first year at community college. 3 days after a winter stroke, Elaine sold the house quickly. The lathe went to an auctioneer, the bending form to a scrap buyer, and Amos's chisels disappeared in a box-marked kitchen. Sadie arrived after the truck had gone and found only his canvas tool roll beneath a loose stair tread, smelling faintly of oil and cedar. At 22, she took a job at Calder Woodworks outside Asheville. Vernon Calder moved through the mill in clean boots while everyone else wore sawdust to the knees. He locked replacement blades in his office, delayed repairs with a raised palm, and called blocked exits temporary storage. The dust collector coughed black powder from a patched seam. When workers asked about insurance forms, he folded the papers once and slid them beneath a ledger. Sadie stayed because rent came every month whether caution did or not. The fire began before dawn on August 19, 2022. By sunrise, the roof had folded into the finishing room and wet ash lay across the parking lot like grey flour. Calder never appeared. 2 weeks later, Sadie carried her last duffel to the boarding house kitchen, where the landlady set a chipped blue sugar bowl between them and named the unpaid balance. Elaine sat at the table with both hands around a cup she did not drink from. Sadie looked at her mother and waited. You cannot stay here after Friday. Sadie. Leave? The landlady turned the sugar bowl so its crack faced the wall. Elaine lowered her eyes. On September suit. Sadie walked out with the duffel, Amos's tool roll, and $43 folded inside her shoe. For 6 weeks she moved south and east by the cheapest routes she could find in Hendersonville. She slept 2 nights beneath the rear awning of a closed garden center and woke with mulch dust in her hair. $31 remained. In Black Mountain, a church volunteer gave her soup. But the shelter had no open beds, so she lay behind a laundromat where the dryers warmed the brick until midnight. $22. She rode to Asheville and spent 4 nights in the bus station before security began checking tickets. Rain drove her beneath the loading dock of an old furniture warehouse near the French Broad River. $14. She washed in library restrooms, changed socks behind locked stall doors, and learned which benches were visible from police cars. By the 6th Monday she had $9 and a heel worn through to cardboard. Cold rain brought her into the Pack Memorial Library before opening. She stood beneath the stone arch until a librarian with copper-framed glasses unlocked the door and pretended not to notice the water dripping from Sadie's sleeves. On the 2nd floor, beside a bulletin board crowded with tutoring notices, Sadie found a county surplus sheet curled under one brass tack. At the bottom was a handwritten addition, condemned craft cabin, contents included, tax transfer fee $9. She copied the parcel number onto the back of an overdue book slip. The property lay beyond Barnardsville, too far to walk in one day, and the transfer deadline was October 21st. She had no fare, no food beyond half a biscuit, and no reason to believe the cabin could shelter anyone. She folded the notice into Amos's tool roll anyway. By noon, Sadie was walking north toward the mountains, carrying $9 toward a house the county had already decided to erase. By dusk, the rain had thinned to mist, and Sadie reached the northbound bus stop beside a shuttered tire store, with 6 miles still between her and the county line. The driver let her ride as far as Weaverville after she placed 7 of her $9 into the fare tray and stood there 1 second too long. From Weaverville she walked 11 miles along old roads that climbed and narrowed, slept beneath loose hay in a tobacco barn outside Jupiter, and woke before dawn to 29 degrees, her breath whitening the rafters above her. Barnardsville appeared gradually, first a church steeple, then a row of brick fronts gathered beside the road. She passed Hensley Feed and Seed, Boone Hardware, Larkspur Cafe, Carter's Pharmacy, and a narrow shop called Blue Ridge Shoe Repair, where one boot hung from a wire in the window. The town smelled of coffee, damp leaves, and wood smoke, caught low beneath the mountains. The Buncombe County Annex occupied a former bank with limestone steps polished pale at the center. Sadie entered carrying the barn's straw on her coat and found the clerk's office behind a pane of wired glass. The woman at the counter wore a silver chain that disappeared into the collar of a brown dress. Her nameplate read MRS, Irene Talbot. She looked at Sadie's duffel, then at the parcel number written on the library slip. You understand the roof is failing? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no legal water service? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not repair the road? Yes, ma'am. You understand the structure may be unsafe to occupy? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Talbot studied her face, perhaps searching for bravado, perhaps for confusion. Finding neither, she drew a deed packet from a grey folder and turned each page toward Sadie. The transfer fee was $9. Sadie set her final 2 bills and 7 coins on the counter. The clerk counted twice, then pressed a heavy brass stamp onto an ink pad, and brought it down with a sound like a small door closing. Take Dillingham Road east, she said. Past the old fire station, turn left at Paint Fork. After the pavement ends, walk 3/4 of a mile. The cabin sits beyond 2 black walnut trees. She began to slide the deed across, then stopped. Mercer, she said. Was Amos Mercer your kin? Sadie's fingers tightened around the canvas roll. My grandfather. Mrs. Talbot leaned back. A small breath left her through her nose. He came through here in 1978 looking for Ezra Bell. Asked every old man in the county who still knew how to fit a bell bronze ring to a maple rim. Ezra had already been dead 6 years. The room seemed to narrow around the wired glass. Did he say why? He said he had one unfinished lesson. Mrs. Talbot placed the deed flat beneath her palm. I remember because he paid for copies of 3 property maps and left $1 in my drawer by mistake. I kept it in an envelope. Never knew where to send it. She opened the bottom drawer and touched a yellowed envelope, but did not remove it. Perhaps some things wait until the right person asks the right question. Sadie looked at the surname on the deed, then at the road directions. Amos had never mentioned Barnardsville, Ezra Bell, or an unfinished lesson. She folded the papers once, careful not to crease the county seal. Paint Fork Road followed a creek through pastureland gone brown with October. A man repairing fence wire lifted 2 fingers from his pliers without speaking. Beside him, a red hound barked until Sadie passed the gate, then returned to sniffing the mud. Farther on, black walnut trees leaned above the lane, their leaves thin and yellow, their fallen hulls staining the ground dark as bruises. The cabin stood 60 feet beyond them, smaller than the notice had made it seem. It measured perhaps 24 feet by 30, built of chestnut logs chinked with lime mortar and later covered on the front with weathered poplar boards. The roof sagged over the north room, and one chimney shoulder had lost 6 or 7 bricks. Above the porch, a hand-painted sign hung by one chain, E-Bell, Banjo-Maker. Wind turned it against the siding with a slow wooden knock. Sadie pushed the door with her shoulder. It opened 3 inches and stopped against something heavy. She set down the duffel, worked her arm through the gap, and dragged aside a collapsed chair. The air inside tasted of dust and old metal. Cherry sawdust lay in drifts along the baseboards, still faintly sweet beneath the smell of mouse nests and damp plaster. Her boots found grit, then a loose plank that answered with a hollow complaint. The front room held a bench beneath 2 clouded windows. Rusted hooks lined one wall, and a cracked banjo neck rested where someone had left it, its pearl inlay missing from the 5th fret. When Sadie touched the bench, dust lifted and settled on her tongue. Somewhere behind the wall, a squirrel scratched twice and went still. The back room was colder. Calfskin heads, dry as thin parchment, curled inside a wooden crate. Brass rings stood on edge beneath a shelf, some green with corrosion, some blackened by age. A narrow cot had collapsed on one side, and rainwater had gathered in a wash basin beneath a hole in the roof. Each drop struck with a bright, patient note. She opened the chimney damper and smelled wet ash. No fire tonight. Instead, she swept one rectangle of floor with a broken broom, spread her coat over the least warped boards, and placed Amos's tool roll beneath her head. Darkness arrived early in the hollow. Through the roof opening she could see one star, sharp and unmoving. The sign knocked outside. Water struck the basin. The house made small sounds around her, not welcoming and not refusing. The greatest echoes sometimes come from empty circles, and loss is the hollow where a new song begins. At first light, Sadie found the well behind the cabin by following moss-dark stones through the weeds. Its wooden cover had split, but the rope still held. She lowered the bucket until it struck water after 11 seconds, drew up 3 gallons clouded with leaf dust, and boiled the clearest portion in a dented kettle. The outhouse stood 40 yards uphill, listing east but usable once she nailed a cedar brace across its rear wall. By the 3rd night she knew which floorboards merely complained, and which one near the stove could drop a boot heel into the crawl space. On the 4th morning she walked back to Barnardsville, and entered Boone Hardware beneath a bell that gave one tired ring. The store smelled of kerosene and dry iron. Behind the counter stood Silas Boone, a broad man with 1 white eyebrow and 1 brown, as though winter had reached only half his face. "You are the Bell Cabin girl." "I own the Bell Cabin." "That is a different sentence." He read her list, rubbed his thumb over the paper, and opened a narrow ledger. "I can give you 30 days. You write every item, every price, and every payment. No guessing." "I have no payment yet." "Then start with work." He pushed a slim booklet toward her. The cover read Home Repairs for Rural Owners. Free, because nobody has asked for it since Carter was president. Sadie bought only what could prevent the cabin from worsening: a chimney brush for $6.75, 20 feet of rope for $2.10, stove cement for $1.85, a pound of cut nails for $1.20, 2 lamp wicks for 60 cents, and a used handsaw for $4.50. Silas entered each amount in blue ink beneath Mercer. Sadie. The chimney came first. She tied the brush to the rope, climbed onto the low porch roof, and tested each shingle before trusting it. From the ridge she fed the brush down the flue, twisting clockwise so the bristles would not catch between bricks. The first pull brought dry soot. The second released a plate of glazed creosote that broke against the hearth like black glass. She covered the stove opening with a damp flour sack, worked the brush from top and bottom, then scraped the smoke shelf with a bent strip of iron. It took 5 hours and left her forearms trembling. Before lighting anything, she held a rolled catalogue page beneath the open damper. The flame leaned upward. The draught was weak but steady. She packed 2 cracks in the stove collar with cement, waited until evening, and built a test fire no larger than both hands. Smoke lifted cleanly. Iron began to tick as it warmed. She added 3 pieces of split oak and set the kettle on top. Her first hot meal in the cabin was cornmeal stirred with water and salt, eaten from a chipped bowl while the stove gave off old ash and new heat. The next morning, she began the workroom inventory. She chose only what could tell her how the shop had functioned. A maple bending form scorched at every clamp point, 3 graving tools wrapped in oilcloth, a foot-powered lathe missing its belt, a pearl cutting saw fine enough to bend between 2 fingers, ebony fingerboards marked in pencil, a brass casting ladle with a repaired handle, 2 wooden gauges labelled 11-inch and 12-inch, and a shallow drawer of silver screws, each head engraved with a 6-petalled flower. Most of the banjo parts were ruined. Several rims had opened at the glue line. The calfskin heads cracked when lifted. Brass tone rings sat beneath the bench in a nest of shavings and mouse-chewed paper. Sadie carried them one by one into the light. The first rang dull when she suspended it from twine and tapped it with Amos's smallest chisel. The second gave a short, bright note. The third did not ring at all. It made a muted double sound. Metal followed by something softer. She tapped again. Metal, then wood. The ring was heavier than the others by perhaps 2 pounds. Its inner skirt showed no solder seam, but one narrow section had a different colour where dust had not settled evenly. Sadie weighed it against 2 ordinary rings using a beam scale from the shelf. The pointer dipped hard to the left. She ran her fingernail along the inner wall and found the edge of a cedar disc fitted so closely beneath the brass that it looked like part of the pattern. 3 silver screws held it in place. Their engraved heads matched those in the drawer. Sadie did not force them. She wiped the screw slots with lamp oil, waited an hour, and chose a graving tool whose tip fit exactly. The first screw turned under steady pressure. The second resisted until she warmed the brass with her palm. The third released with a sound smaller than a seed striking glass. The cedar disc lifted 1 fraction of an inch. Beneath it lay 4 packets wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with faded linen thread. A 5th object, a square tin box no larger than a hymn book, occupied the centre. Everything had been packed so tightly that no piece could shift when the ring was moved. Sadie carried the ring to the bench and closed the door against the wind. The first packet contained 6 small files, each ground to a different curve, their handles dark from another person's hands. The second held strips of pearl and abalone separated by onion skin paper. The third contained bell bronze ingots stamped with weight marks. The fourth held the silver fitting set, hooks, nuts, coordinator rod caps, and engraved screws completing the unfinished hardware in the drawer. The tin box had no lock. Inside, banknotes lay flat beneath a square of cotton. Coins filled 3 cloth rolls, and under them rested a purple heart dated 1944, its ribbon faded toward grey. A folded sheet of music and a sealed letter occupied the bottom. Sadie moved the letter aside without opening it. She counted the money at the bench, then counted it again on the floor where no coin could roll beneath the cabinet. There were $20 gold pieces, silver Morgan dollars, worn half dollars, and Liberty head nickels wrapped in paper marked by year. The banknotes were bound in packets of 50 and 100. Together they came to $28,100. The number did not seem possible inside that room. She checked her arithmetic a third time, writing each subtotal in the repair manual's margin. Nothing changed. The cabin still leaked. The stove still needed watching. Her boots were still wet at the toes. Yet the amount remained exact beneath her hand. She returned every coin to its roll, every note to its packet, and placed the medal above them. The sheet music showed a banjo line in a minor key, with no words and no title. At the top right corner, someone had written in pencil, "For when the ashes cool." The sealed letter bore only one word, Mercer. Sadie carried it outside at dusk, but did not break the seal. She crossed the weeds to the well, sat on the stone curb, and watched the bucket's black surface tremble whenever wind moved through the walnuts. Somewhere below, water continued entering the old shaft one clear drop at a time. The greatest echoes sometimes come from empty circles, and loss is the hollow where a new song begins. At sunrise, Sadie returned to the workbench and set the envelope beside the cold stove. The writing on its face slanted forward with a long tail beneath the final R. She had seen that hand on Amos's sharpening notes, on birthday cards, and once on a paper sack containing 2 perfect peaches. He had addressed the letter before she was born. She warmed the wax seal between her palms until it softened, then opened it with the pearl saw. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then you have removed the cedar plate without splitting it, and that tells me more about you than a name could. An impatient person would have pried. A careless person would have missed the screws. You stopped, studied the work, and chose the fitting tool. That is enough for me to trust you with what follows. In March of 1978, Dr. Miriam Cole at St. Joseph's Hospital in Asheville told me that the weakness in my hands came from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. She said there would be less time than I hoped and more time than I feared. I came here to find Ezra Bell, who had once promised to teach me the casting method his family kept. I arrived 6 years too late. Ezra's great-grandfather, Josiah Bell, born in 1841 near Morganton, began turning drum rims after the Civil War. His daughter Ruth Bell, born in 1878, moved the work to this cabin in 1901 and fitted the first bronze ring here. Ruth's son, Samuel, born in 1905, carried their patterns to Knoxville during the Depression. Samuel's daughter Helen married Thomas Mercer in 1946, and their son was me, Amos Mercer, born in 1931 in Blount County, Tennessee. The trade closed on November 3, 1944, after Ruth received word that her only son, Daniel Bell, had died with the 28th Infantry Division in the Hurtgen Forest. Samuel was her nephew, not her son, and grief made the distinction matter to her. She locked the shop and never made another instrument. For more than 30 years, no finished banjo left this room. There are matters the hands must remember. Steam maple strips for 20 minutes per quarter inch of thickness, and bend them while they are still too hot to hold. For hide glue, use 1 part dry granules to 2 parts cold water. Let it swell overnight, then warm it no higher than 145 degrees. Bell bronze should be close to 4 parts copper to 1 part tin, though sound must judge what numbers cannot. When fitting the ring, leave no more than 0.02 of an inch at the skirt. A tight ring strangles, a loose ring lies. The silver fittings were Ruth's last complete set. The medal belonged to Daniel. The money came from 4 generations of work, land sales, and wages saved by people who expected the shop to open again. Do not mistake it for a prize. It is stored labor. Use only what allows the work to continue, and leave enough that someone after you will not have to begin with empty hands. Inheritance is not blood alone. It is the blade sharpened before it is put away. It is a roof-kept sound for the person who has not arrived. It is the patience to make one true thing when no one is waiting to buy it. I could not finish the lesson I came here to learn. My hands failed before my will did. If yours are steady, continue slowly. If they are not, keep the place until steadier hands appear. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Amos James Mercer. October 6, 1978. Sadie read the letter twice. On the second reading, she stopped at the words stored labor and placed both palms flat on the bench. Then she folded the pages along their original creases, neither adding a new one nor pressing the old ones sharper. The back door mentioned in Amos's notes had swollen shut. She worked a putty knife along the frame, leaned her shoulder into the lower panel, and stepped into wet grass when it gave. Beyond the chimney stood a waist-high granite marker buried under honeysuckle. Its face carried the same six-petaled flower engraved on the silver screws. Beneath it, shallow letters read Ruth Bell's Casting Pit. She cleared the vines by hand. Under a loose stone lay a small brass alcohol lamp blackened by use, its wick sealed beneath a threaded cap. Sadie filled it with fuel from Silas's cleaning shelf, carried it inside, and struck a match. The flame rose blue at the base and gold above, no wider than her smallest finger. Its light reached the bending form, the pearl saw, and Amos's letter. Other hands seemed to stand nearby without entering the room. The librarian who had opened the doors early and overlooked Sadie's dripping coat. The bus driver who had waited while $7 fell into the tray. The church volunteer who had filled a paper bowl past its rim. Mrs. Talbot, keeping one misplaced dollar through 44 years of office moves. None had known what came next. Each had only made the next hour possible. Perhaps you remember such a kindness from your own life. A meal left without questions, a ride given in bad weather, a door held open when every other door had closed. What was the smallest kindness someone gave you when you needed it most? You may place it in the comments, not as a debt, but as a way of keeping that person's quiet work alive. That night, Sadie returned the money to the tin box and set it beneath the workbench. She laid the silver fittings, Daniel's medal, Amos's letter, and the little brass lamp beside her bedroll. The flame went out before midnight, but the metal retained its warmth for a long while. The first snow came on December 2 and measured 4 inches on the porch rail. It softened the collapsed shingles, but also showed where heat escaped, 2 dark channels above the stoveroom and a widening patch along the north valley. Sadie read the roofing chapter in the repair manual 3 times, once beside the stove, once beneath the eaves, and once with a pencil marking every term she did not yet trust. The cabin roof measured 28 by 34 feet with a steep rear pitch. Allowing for overlap and waste, she calculated 12 squares of cedar shingles, 4 rolls of felt, and nearly 20 pounds of hot-dipped nails. The numbers cost more than she could place on credit, so she salvaged sound shingles from the abandoned woodshed and bought only enough new cedar for the exposed slope. Silas Boone handed her a roofing hatchet worn bright along one cheek. My brother used it 30 years. Sadie turned the tool in her hand. I will bring it back sharp. You will bring yourself back first. A former roofer named Hollis Crane arrived the next morning carrying a coil of rope and wearing a red wool cap stitched twice at the crown. He refused money, coffee, and explanation. He tested the rafters with his heel, then showed Sadie how to fasten a sister rafter beside the split north member, drawing the boards together with carriage bolts rather than trusting nails in weakened wood. For 11 days they worked beneath skies the colour of unpolished tin. Sadie snapped chalk lines every 5 inches, laid felt from the eaves upward, and learned Hollis's 3-stroke method. Start the nail, seat the shingle, finish with the flat face. On the 4th day he touched one raised head with the hatchet. That nail's proud. Set it again. She reached for the hammer. Pull it. Do not hammer twice. By December 14th, the last ridge cap was bedded, trimmed, and nailed beneath a clear afternoon sky. Snowmelt ran over the new cedar without entering the basin inside. That night, for the first time, Sadie moved it away from the stove. January exposed what the fire had concealed. 6 chimney bricks had begun to spoil, their faces flaking away in red shells, mortar near the roofline powdered beneath Sadie's thumb. She removed each failed joint with a narrow chisel, brushing the gaps until no loose grit remained, then mixed 2 parts hydraulic lime to 1 part fine sand. Around the flue tile, where heat mattered more than weather, she added fire clay at a ratio of 1 part to 3 parts mortar. The work lasted 3 weeks, most afternoons remaining in the 20s. Metal tools burned colder than the air. Sadie worked bare-handed because gloves dulled the pressure she needed. But every 15 minutes her fingers went numb, and she had to hold them beneath her arms until the ache returned. Hollis appeared twice without being asked. He showed her how to dampen old brick before repointing so it would not steal water from the fresh mix. Then left before supper. Near the crown, Sadie found 1 brick too damaged to turn and reuse. Silas located a matching hand-molded replacement behind his store, its frog still carrying the faint mark of a local kiln. She bedded it in lime, struck the joint concave, and covered the work with burlap against the night frost. On January 29th, she built a test fire from pine kindling and 3 dry oak splits. Smoke rose through the repaired throat, past the new crown, and drew cleanly into the pale sky. Sadie watched from the yard until the last blue thread disappeared above the walnuts. Beneath the soot and grey dirt, the floors were white pine fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails whose uneven tops caught the scraper. Sadie set every loose nail below the surface with a square punch, replaced 2 split boards from the woodshed loft, and rented Silas's random orbit sander for $14 a day. She began with 80 grit, moving diagonally across the grain only where old cupping demanded it. The second pass at 120 followed the boards. The third, at 220, quieted the final scratches around the hearth and workbench legs. Dust reached the hinges, her eyebrows and the seams of Amos's canvas rolled despite every sheet she hung. The first oil coat disappeared almost at once. She waited a day, rubbed the boards with coarse cloth and applied 2 more thin coats, leaving 48 hours for the final cure. The wood changed from dark honey near the walls toward mahogany where feet had crossed the room for generations. Nail heads remained visible as black, irregular stars. One morning in early February, Sadie woke unable to lift the sander from its crate. She carried no tools that day. Instead, she walked to the marsh below Paint Fork and sat on a fallen sycamore while a great blue heron stood ankle-deep in silver water. It moved only once, folding its neck and striking beneath the surface. Sadie watched until dusk and returned without apologizing to the unfinished floor. The next morning, she completed the final pass. There were 8 windows in the cabin. 3 had no glass, 4 held cracked panes, and 1 retained a wavy original sheet dated in pencil beneath the sash, 1788. It had likely been carried from an older house and fitted here later. Sadie preserved every inch of it. She removed the damaged sash one at a time, labeling each mortise in chalk. Old putty came away under gentle heat and a dull knife. For the replacements, she rolled DAP 33 glazing putty between her palms, pressed a continuous bed into the rabbet, seated the glass without forcing the corners, then tooled the outer bevel so rain would run cleanly onto the wood. The sash weights had dropped inside the walls where their cords had rotted. Sadie opened the narrow pockets, vacuumed out mouse husks with a hand bellows, and threaded 1/4-inch cotton sash cord over each pulley. She tied the counterweights with figure-8 knots, testing every knot twice before closing the pockets. The old 1788 pane received no scraper and no new paint along its glass. She cleaned it with warm water, chalk, and a cloth soft enough not to catch its bubbles. When sunlight passed through, the workbench bent slightly in the view, as though the room were being remembered rather than seen. On the final afternoon, she raised the last restored sash and felt it balance at any height. Outside, a chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch, turned its black-capped head toward the open room, and remained there while the new cord settled silently over the pulley. Behind the stove, the walls still carried horsehair plaster pressed over hand-split oak lath. Sadie's first patch near the chimney dried too quickly and cracked. The second sagged between the laths. The third detached in one whole piece when she touched its edge. Silas brought an old feed bag from his barn, half filled with clean horsehair his wife had saved from brushing their mare. Sadie cut the fibres to thumb length and mixed them into lime plaster until each handful pulled apart without clumping. She dampened the lath pressed on a scratch coat and scored it diagonally with the teeth of a broken comb. The brown coat went on 3/8 of an inch thick and cured beneath damp cloth for 72 hours. She finished with a 1/8 inch coat, smoothing it with a steel trowel only after the surface had begun to firm. The repaired wall remained slightly uneven, as the old wall had always been. Sadie rested her palm against it and followed the faint rise over the chimney stones. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Hensley owned the Larkspur Cafe and wore her grey hair in a braid thick as a bell rope. Twice a week she left paper bags on the cabin step, biscuits wrapped in a dish towel, bean soup sealed in a jar, or an apple with one bruised side carefully cut away. Sadie once carried $3 to the cafe and laid them beside the register. Doris pushed the coins back with one floury finger. In candles when the shop reopens. No reopening date had been discussed. Doris turned toward the griddle as though the matter had already been settled. A boy named Caleb Price arrived in March on a green Schwinn bicycle, a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow-shouldered, and had a pale crescent scar beneath his chin. Without asking permission, he began reducing the wind-fallen oak behind the outhouse into stove lengths. Sadie offered him money. He shook his head and drove the maul through another round. My mother said, "About your grandfather." That was all he explained. Before leaving, she stacked the wood bark side upward and tightened the bicycle chain with a nail. Reverend Boyd walked past each morning carrying a black lunch pail. Though his church stood in the opposite direction, he had one trouser cuff permanently higher than the other. At the walnut gate he tipped his hat, studied the day's work without praise or inspection, and offered the same four-word prayer, "Keep these hands steady." Then he continued down the road before Sadie could answer. The cellar waited until February 11th because every earlier task kept rain. Smoke saw cold closer to the surface. Its entrance lay beneath a trapdoor in the back room. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot chamber floored in fieldstone. The air smelled of earth and rusted jar lids. At the centre stood one dressed granite slab too regular to belong among the smaller stones. A 6-petaled craft mark had been carved into its face. Sadie swept around it but did not lift it. Under the 3rd step, her brush struck wood. She worked free a small oak box wedged behind the riser, its lid held by a brass clasp gone green at the hinge. Inside lay a key and a tintype. The key's bow had been shaped into a banjo pot, complete with tiny brackets around the rim. The tintype showed a young woman standing outside the cabin in 1903. She held a turning chisel against her skirt and looked directly into the camera. Her mouth, brow, and narrow chin resembled Sadie's closely enough that she carried the image upstairs before believing what she had seen. On the back, in brown ink, were the words Ruth Bell, daughter of Josiah, age 25, summer of 1903. Sadie placed the tintype beside Amos's letter. The key remained on the mantel, where morning light reached it through the restored glass. She tried it in every lock inside the cabin, then stopped. Whatever it opened had waited this long without harm. Snow withdrew first from the south wall and then from the walnut roots. Paint Fork Creek grew loud with mountain runoff, carrying twigs and yellow foam around the bends. By April, catkins hung from the walnut branches like small green cords, and the cabin smelled of lime seed oil and thawed earth. Sadie did not begin a full banjo that spring. Her hands were steadier, but steadiness was not the same as readiness. She selected one worn silver coin from the cache and exchanged it through a dealer for maple strips, hide glue, calf skin, and a small piece of bell bronze. She practiced scarf joints on scrap, cut pearl stars no larger than lentils, and bent forerims that would never become instruments. Each failure stayed on the shelf with its date written beneath it. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, on December 6, 224, Sadie tightened the final bracket on the first complete banjo made in the cabin since the trade had closed. The rim was 3-ply maple, each strip steam-bent and joined so cleanly the seams vanished beneath oil. She had cast the tone ring in a sand mould behind the old granite marker, then filed its skirt until a 2/1000ths gauge passed with slight resistance. The fingerboard carried 12 pearl leaves copied from Ruth's silver fittings. The calfskin head had been mounted damp, dried for 2 days, and tightened by quarter turns while sleet touched the windows. Sadie set the bridge, tuned the 4th string low, and struck one open note. The room answered. The restored interior held no polish beyond what work required. Amos's tools hung above the bench. The old bending form stood beside a new one Sadie had built from laminated ash. The 1788 pane remained wavy, the floor kept its black nail heads, and the plaster showed the shape of every hand-smoothed patch. A narrow bed occupied the back room. Nothing extravagant had entered. The brass key continued to hang from the mantel until the morning after the banjo was finished. A hard frost silvered the yard, and one of the black walnut trees dropped a dead limb beside the lane. When Sadie dragged it away, she noticed a rectangular brass plate set into the trunk's sheltered side, nearly swallowed by bark. Moss had hidden all but one corner. At its centre was a keyhole shaped like a narrow comma. The banjo bow key entered without resistance. A small iron-lined compartment opened inside the tree. It had remained dry beneath a pitched copper cap hidden in the bark. Within lay a folded 48-star American flag wrapped in waxed linen and a note dated December 24th, 1944. The handwriting belonged to Ruth. She wrote that Daniel's flag had been delivered without his body and that she could not bear to place it in the shop, where every tool reminded her of the hands he had used there as a boy. She had hidden it in the living tree because walnut endured by closing slowly around a wound. She asked that whoever found it wait until the shop held music again before bringing the flag into daylight. Sadie carried both objects inside. She unfolded the flag across the workbench, revealing stars arranged in 6 straight rows. The cloth had yellowed along the creases but remained whole. The note ended with one practical request: oil the compartment hinge before you close it. Trees move even when they appear still. Sadie obeyed. On December 16th, the anniversary of the first day of the Battle of the Bulge, she brought Daniel Bell's Purple Heart to the Western Carolina State Veterans Cemetery in Black Mountain. His remains were not buried there, but a memorial stone carried his name among Buncombe County's war dead. She placed the medal beneath the folded flag for 1 quiet hour, then returned both to the cabin before evening frost formed. The money changed her life mostly by not being spent. She used 4 coins. One bought the first practice materials. A second paid for chimney scaffolding too dangerous to improvise. A third purchased a used metal lathe from a retiring machinist in Marion. The fourth paid the county taxes during a winter when 3 promised repairs were delayed. The remaining notes and coins went back into the tin box. Sadie wrapped them in new archival paper, added Amos's letter and an inventory in her own hand, then sealed the cedar disc behind the brass ring once more. On the paper she wrote only, for the next one: count carefully. Begin slowly. The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a lost dog notice and a church supper menu. Hand-fitted banjo repairs, 1 at a time. Ask for Sadie at the Bell cabin. The first customer brought a neck with a twisted heel. The second needed a skinhead mounted before his father's birthday. Sadie accepted no more work than the bench could hold. By spring, her mailing list had 43 names written in a school notebook, though only 6 had ever visited the cabin. Caleb returned on the 2nd anniversary of the deed transfer. He was taller and arrived in a truck instead of on the Schwinn. In the bed lay a sign carved from walnut. He had copied the lettering from the old porch board: E. Bell. Banjo Maker. Beneath it, He had added 2 words in smaller letters, and daughters. Sadie stood with her hands in her coat pockets. There were daughters, Caleb said. Ruth was one. There may be more. He nodded, as though that had been his reason from the beginning. Together they removed the old sign, repaired its broken chain, and mounted both boards side by side rather than replacing one with the other. The first sign carried weather and 1 century of silence. The second was pale from the carving knife. That evening, Sadie sat at the bench with a clean sheet of paper. She had delayed the task because every opening she tried sounded borrowed. At last, she placed Amos's letter on her left and Ruth's tintype on her right. She began, "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote that the roof held, the chimney drew clean, and the well water remained sweet after boiling. She explained where the floor dipped, which walnut limb needed watching, and why the 3rd fret inlay on her first banjo sat 1 hair left of centre. She listed the names of people who had helped without requiring their kindness to become a story about themselves. Then she wrote the sentence, Amos had trusted to work rather than blood. Inheritance was the tool made ready for an unknown hand. Before sealing the letter, she opened the unfinished sheet music marked, "For when the ashes cool." During the previous winter, she had added no lyrics. She had only completed the final 8 measures, letting the melody return to its first note without resolving into triumph. She played it once beneath the walnut branches. The greatest echoes sometimes come from empty circles, and loss is the hollow where a new song begins. Snow began before she finished. It gathered on the restored roof, softened the new sign, and covered the road marks left by Caleb's truck. Sadie carried the banjo inside, closed the balanced sash, and added 1 split of oak to the stove. The banjo maker's cabin waits. It has always waited. In the county annex, Mrs. Talbot retired the following spring. Before leaving, she emptied her desk except for 1 yellowed envelope in the bottom drawer. Inside remained the dollar Amos had forgotten in 1978. She wrote Sadie Mercer beneath his name, closed the envelope, and left it for the next clerk. Script complete. Total approximately 40,300 characters.